Tara was my daughter. She was a human being. She had dreams.
Something happened in the house.
Everything that day pointed to trouble.
She was involved in quite a struggle, but we really did not have a clue if she was still alive or not. Any idea that I had that this case was going to be routine went out the window.
It was a nightmare for a very, very long time.
A ribbon was found in the front yard.
We're hoping to talk to you for a few minutes.
Somebody had driven a vehicle within a few feet of the front door.
They just know I know more than what I'm saying.
It's in my blood to close the case for the family. That's what I do.
I would never just let it go. Never, never.
It's just another day. I had to be to work early, so I didn't wake anybody up when I left the house.
Tara's brother and sister were getting ready to get on the bus. I have 3 children. Tara's my oldest. Tara was sleeping. So I went to Tara's room. She shared with her sister. And I believe the covers were over her head.
The night before, Sharon had asked 19-year-old Tara to stay home the next day to deal with the plumbers who were due at the house to look at a septic tank problem.
So I woke Tara up to let her know that I was leaving and that the septic company was coming. She had her earrings and she had her hair still with the ribbons, and as normal, I told her I loved her. And then I went to work.
When I left work, I just went directly home, and I pulled up. I seen Tara's car was still in the drive, and Veronica, she said, Tara's not here. I said, where's your sister? She told me she didn't know. And then I looked in Tara's room, and I could see all of her stuff was there.
Keith had called me at work. I knew something was wrong, and I immediately left work. There's no way that Tara would have not told us where she was going or what she was doing. And I remember crying and praying to please don't let nothing be wrong with my Tara.
Taking care of Tara and her siblings was one of the main reasons Keith and Sharon moved here from Scranton, Pennsylvania.
We made the move to Florida to try to make a good life, you know what I mean? Like, you know, we heard about the schools and everything down there. You live there a year, then you go to college for free. So we thought, you know, that would be great for Tara too. What attracted me to Punta Gorda was it was a safe area. You know, it wasn't like a part of Florida where it was like real crazy and wild.
Arriving in late summer, in time for the kids to start at a new school, they rent a house in a quiet neighborhood.
We were very family-oriented. We attended all functions together, every cheerleading event, every violin concert. Tara and I would go shopping, of course. We both loved to dance. We just enjoyed spending time no matter what it was. Tara liked to hang out with her friends, played softball, loved cheerleading. Tara was popular for many reasons. You know, her kindness, her outgoingness, and she cared about others. Tara worked in the Port Charlotte Mall in a jewelry kiosk, and she liked it. Tara wanted a belly button ring. She thought that it was pretty, and it looked good on her.
I wasn't too thrilled with it, but I couldn't tell her no. I mean, she was old enough to make her own decision anyway.
Even though Tara is technically an adult, she always tells her parents if she's going out. So when Keith arrives home that evening to find her missing, he's immediately concerned.
Her purse was there, her car keys were laying out and stuff. I mean, she'd definitely take her purse with her. And I know she would never leave the door open. I mean, it's just the type of girl she was. And I'm just looking through the rooms. When I looked in our room, I opened my drawer and I looked in there. My jewelry was gone, my money was gone. Everything pointed to trouble. I just called the sheriff's department right away.
When I got home, there was a police officer there already, and I just was concentrated on, you know, Tara's not here. Like, my daughter's not here. I know my daughter. Something isn't right. And they try to say that maybe she was at a football game or she was here or there. But I kept expressing, I know my Tara. She would not just leave without telling us. My Tara would never, ever do that.
Initially, they treated it as a burglary, but that first hour that she was gone, that Sharon had gotten home, she knew, and no one would listen. Something about, oh, she's an adult. It's bull. Plain simple. You know, I don't care if your child's 3 or your child's 90. Still your child. I'm trying to do this nicely, but it's very hard. I get very angry with the way it went in the beginning.
It was very frustrating, like I felt like I wasn't being heard.
The patrol officer writes up a report on the stolen items and interviews 2 neighbors who saw nothing suspicious.
Our hopes were that Tara's going to appear. She's going to make a phone call to Mom, Dad. Hey, sorry I didn't call in last night, and it'd all be done and over. That was the hope.
Keith and Sharon call friends to help them look for Tara.
We're in the house, and our one friend was like, what's this? Is this Tara's earring? And you had to pull it out of the carpet. It wasn't just laying there. It was embedded.
That was the one Tara was wearing the day before.
You just think of, why are they embedded in the carpet? And it wasn't a good conclusion in my head. So that was frightening. By this time, I was out of my mind. I just, someone help. I just wanted help me. Somebody help me.
That first night was the night from hell, I guess you could say, because there was no sleeping at all. We just kept staring at and listening, like, and you're just looking and you're waiting.
Every time a car would drive by, my head was out the window.
You open the door to see, just thinking, hoping, somebody's dropping her off and she's late or something, but I was just hoping she'd come home and say, sorry about the mess. We had no idea what happened. The wheels are just spinning, but nothing's coming out of it.
I knew from that car ride home, but at the same time, my heart and mind are like, no way. Maybe, just maybe. Maybe she's somewhere. I just kept calling. I even called friends in Pennsylvania. You do whatever you have to do. You call whoever you have to call, and I was grasping at any straw that I could find.
It was being worked as a burglary case, and the next day, Tara still had not showed up back home. Any idea that I had that this case was going to be routine went out the window.
After a long, sleepless night, Sharon files an official missing persons report.
It was such devastation because who wants to do that? And there were so many emotions that I had. I don't even know.
Sergeant Brian Harrison searches the house for any signs of a struggle.
I recall walking into the bedroom, and you could observe the mattress and box spring were slightly separated from one another. And we could see some what looked like shoe or scuff marks on a dresser, which indicates to me a potential struggle. There was no blood, but that doesn't mean that there has to be blood in order for there to be foul play.
He finds another red flag in the front yard.
At the front of the house, there was a small palm tree near the front door that was pushed over, and on either side of it was tire tracks, indicating to me that somebody had driven a vehicle into the front yard, and it was just within a few feet of the front door. It certainly raised the level of concern. Let's secure this scene, all hands on deck, and let's find Tara.
Something happened in the house, and there were some things found in the house, but they came up with 0 forensics that were related to the actual crime. So that led to that somebody may have come in and intentionally cleaned up.
A closer search of the yard turns up a worrying piece of evidence.
A ribbon was found in the front yard, same type of ribbon that Tara wore in her hair. That would lead me to believe that that came out of Tara's hair and she was carried out the front door and probably it fell out of her hair. That was the most reasonable scenario I could come up with.
The search for the missing teen intensifies.
We get different teams to help us with the searches. We use extensively cadaver dogs, we used horseback, and we would organize searches too. Sometimes we would get a tip. Hey, I saw something that out here about that time, or I've seen buzzard or animal activity. We would check every one of those. We really did not have a clue where Tara was, or how she disappeared, or if she was still alive or not. We just did not know at that point.
Police interview Tara's friends and neighbors, hoping to establish the events leading up to her disappearance.
A tip was received that Tara was seen with a boy at the football game. The detectives, of course, jumped right on that. They did run the lead down, and it turned out that it wasn't the Tara that we were looking for. We had tons of leads come in. I don't know how this one in particular got twisted around, but twisted information we live with every day. All of that has to be followed up, no matter how far out it seems. So it's very time consuming.
It turned out Tara had been out the night before to a club, and we talked to some of her friends that she had gone to the club with, and they all indicate Tara was there and Tara was fine.
Sharon contacted Tara's work. Her friend had told her that Tara had called her around 12:07. They talked on the phone for 10 or 15 minutes. Tara planned to come pick up her check, go to the bank. Tara would have had to have left her home probably by no later than 3 o'clock, but she never left the house. So we were able to establish a timeline of windows of opportunity. This crime had to occur between a certain time in the morning and 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Next, investigators turn their attention to the septic tank workers who were due at Tara's house that day.
This is an older neighborhood, so everybody's on septic. I think we'd had a lot of rain and a lot of the systems were backing up. Numerous septic tank companies had been in and out of the neighborhood pumping out the tanks. A lot of people were outside of their homes because when it backs up in the house, that's not where you want to be. You want to be outside in the fresh air. So people coming and going to the neighbor's house throughout the day. A couple of workmen at the neighbor's house observed a white pickup truck in Tara's driveway up to about 2:15 or 2:30. The neighbor saw a white truck pull in, and she knew the person who was in the truck with another person. They waved at the people next door.
Sergeant Brian Harrison immediately tracks down the driver of the truck, Phil Barr, who runs a company called ABC Septic.
When I spoke with Philip Barr and asked him if he was at Tara's residence the day prior doing some septic work, and he said, yes, I was. And in fact, I can show you the paperwork. He stated that his partner, David McManus, had knocked on the front door and had contact with the young lady at the house. The two of them ended up leaving and no other contact with her.
Police also talked to Barr's live-in girlfriend, Linda Dilley, to corroborate his account.
Part of Phil Barr's alibi for that day was he had been talking with Linda Dilley in the morning at least twice, maybe 3 times, just chit-chatting. Phil said they had made plans that he would run to the store and buy some steaks. And Linda said when she got home around 1:30 for lunch, that Phil had left a note saying that there were steaks in the refrigerator.
McManus and Barr say they briefly entered Tara's house to test the toilet. Barr tells investigators that he saw a young man in the bedroom.
As I recall, he was sitting on one of the beds. He described him as a young man with dark hair.
It could be a boyfriend, someone that the family doesn't know about, that perhaps they left the house together. They could be anywhere.
Then we received information from the kids that lived next door to Tara that there had been a 17-year-old boy that had been cutting the grass of the neighbor's house. These kids said that he ended up having a bunch of change in his pocket, and this kid had some sort of criminal history.
Gandy and his team wonder if the boy with the loose change is the same person Phil Barr and Dave McManus saw in the house.
Of course, one of the items that was indicated missing from the home was change from Keith's dresser. So he obviously came up on the radar as someone we needed to talk to.
This was huge. This person might be responsible for the disappearance of Tara. There was a kid that had been mowing lawns in the neighborhood and that had a substantial amount of change in his pocket. And of course, those are the kinds of things you chase down to try to discover, where did he get the change from? Is the change missing from the house?
He lived about probably 3 blocks from Tara on a different street. So we tracked him down. He was actually on his bike riding the next day and indicated that he had cut the grass, but he didn't know Tara, hadn't been into her house, didn't have anything to do with taking change out of the house. He did have an alibi that was checked, and the majority of change that was taken from the house was silver coins, and he had pennies in his pocket at the time.
We were not able to establish that he had anything to do with our case.
Weeks pass with no trace of Tara and no new leads. Tara's 20th birthday is fast approaching.
We still hope that she's coming back. So we still have a birthday party for her. So presents were bought. And I'll never forget this. I was going to open a present. And my son said to me, he said, "Mom, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm going to open one of her presents." And he said, "No, you're not."
The kid said, no, absolutely not. Just leave it there. When she comes home, she can open it. She just leave it there. She'll get it when she gets here. So just breaks your heart.
So her presence sat on the bed for months till we found her.
After 284 agonizing days and nights, a terrible discovery is made 10 miles from Tara's house.
A construction worker had to go to the bathroom, so he decided he would drive down this long dirt trail, and he walks a couple feet, I guess, and notices what he believed was a human skeleton. We bring in an excavation team, and we painstakingly slowly go through every piece of grass and weeds and dirt and clumps and roots around that area, looking for evidence.
The rain, the elements of Florida are very rough on a decomposing body like that. The decomposition is going to be much more rapid in the heat, and it doesn't take long. You've lost physical evidence, and being able to determine exact cause of death, it can become very difficult.
We found the skull, we found some long bones, and some of the smaller bones, and some of the rib bones.
But we only recovered less than half of the true number of bones that are in a person's body at the time of her death.
So that evening, I went to Tara's mom's, and we pulled up out front and walked up to the door. And she, of course, knew this was coming someday in her heart, and she reacted how you would expect a mother to react.
It was a horrific day. You know what they're coming for. And it just makes it real that you're never going to see your daughter again.
I had a whole lot of anger, a whole lot of guilt. I don't know how to explain it, but just started crying.
How can someone do that to someone else? How can they just like not care?
I can't imagine having to live through that and having to hear those words. It's heartbreaking.
I just wanted answers. I wanted something done. I wanted someone to pay for what they did. I wanted justice.
Even after her body was found, there was really nothing to indicate who was involved with Tara's disappearance and ultimately her death. So you're trying to develop leads and develop information, but we're still in the dark about what had happened.
For the first time in many months, investigators get a new lead.
We discovered that a subject by the name of William told his girlfriend that he was actually called by Tara that day to come and sit with her because she was concerned about some workers coming to the house.
This individual, William, sort of resembled the person that Phil said he had seen in the house.
It was just the person responsible for Tara missing that needed to be explored and eliminated one way or the other.
We just wanted to determine, first of all, was he even there that day? And if he wasn't, why did he make it up?
So I contacted him, talked to him on the phone. Initially, he said that he had been to the house, but Tara wasn't there. So I got him to come in to give us a sworn statement. He said that's not true. That he had told his girlfriend that he was at Tara's house to make her jealous.
William turned out to be just a kid who wanted to make himself look like he was more of a ladies' man than he was.
As the years go by, fresh information dries up.
At some point, you completely run out of leads, and then, of course, I retired. So I didn't have everyday contact with the case.
The case of the murdered teen goes as cold as a winter's day in her hometown of Scranton, Pennsylvania.
It's frustrating when you don't have any leads to follow, but those cases are never closed. Detectives that are working in the Major Crimes Unit will be assigned old cases to work on them when they have time, which never comes. Quite honestly, you cannot work cold cases part-time, and that's just the facts. And then in 2009, the sheriff asked me to come in and start a cold case unit and gave me an opportunity to continue the work on Tara's case, to give it a fresh look.
It's a unit made up of retired police officers, detectives, investigators who were not from the area, not from the agency, who would be able to devote 100% of their attention to these unsolved cases.
You get three different perspectives from old guys who have done this for their entire life. We start at the beginning of the file box, and sometimes these file boxes are a mess. Actually, all the time, these file boxes are a mess because they've been gone through so many times by so many different people that there's little organization there.
A cold case is not an easy case to work because you're second guessing work that had already been done.
What I like to do is just sit back and stare at it. If you stare at it long enough, you're going to start seeing things. And we will find errors 99% of the time.
What jumped out at me was the fact that we had two individuals, Philip Barr and David McManus, the septic workers, and that both of their stories, when they were initially interviewed, appeared to conflict with each other. The stories differed in the number of times that they were at Tara's house on that day, the description of what Tara was wearing, and where they parked Phil Barr's truck. I met Sharon, Tara's mother, after we were assigned her daughter's murder case. I went and visited her when she was living up in Maryland.
By this time, Sharon has left Florida. Her marriage to Keith breaks up under the enormous strain of the case.
I went there to open a line of communication, and I figured it was going to take about an hour. It was about 4 hours, a very emotional time, and truly this woman was devastated. I felt like if I were Sharon, I wouldn't believe a word we were saying because of all the years that had gone by.
I was just like, listening to him, because I've heard a lot of, we're gonna do this, right? I heard all that. So he said, we're gonna treat Tara as our own. And I believed him. They were just always there, no matter what.
We look at every document, and it was probably 12 boxes, 14 boxes of documents.
Took a long time, probably 6-7 months.
Kurt Mell zeroes in on the statement of the neighbor who saw the white pickup at Tara's house on the day she vanished.
I discovered that in the interview of the next door neighbor, she had told the officer that her sister-in-law was present, but she had not identified her sister-in-law. And there was no formal interview in the file. I thought, well, who was this particular lady? And we need to talk to her.
The investigators tracked down the neighbor's sister-in-law.
And she saw a lot more than what the neighbor saw. She witnessed both Philip Barr and David McManus, the septic workers, walk through the front door of Tara's house.
This was Tara's house. This witness observed the white pickup truck with Barr and McManus arrive at this house 2 different times. Was sitting right here where this orange cone is. So she had an unobstructed view. That sago palm was run over by Barr's truck when the witness saw them back up to the front door and open the tailgate. So that all tied in together and made complete sense. The first time, they seemed like they were happy. The second time she saw them, when they backed the truck up, there was an obvious demeanor change. She said that they looked like they were sweaty and looked like they were frantic, in a hurry.
Once we interviewed this witness, we were extremely excited. It was a game changer.
Prosecutors believe they now have enough evidence to charge the 2 septic workers who were questioned early on in the investigation.
David McManus was arrested in Cumberland, Maryland, at his home.
They believe I'm involved.
Yes, they, based on statements that you had made.
That I've made.
Yes, sir. And you weren't just one, according to you, and statements that you've given.
I've never claimed I was there more than once.
Yeah, yeah. So you see, you can't keep your story straight there.
But we did not know where Phil Barr was at the time.
We were able to track Phil Barr down. Philip Barr was sort of on the run. He had assumed a different name and was living up in the Vermont area. We theorized that he was up in that area so he'd be close to Canada in case he ever felt we were getting too close.
The Marshal Service said that when they knocked on the door, he basically tried to get out the back door of the trailer, but they had marshals around the back. They arrested him there.
I didn't do anything. How the hell can they arrest me when I didn't do anything?
It was an awesome feeling that they were behind bars.
I was very, very happy. And in the same sense, you know, you're a little scared, you know, because you want to make sure you get the conviction.
I was confident in the case that we had, but you just never want to get too overconfident. You could have one juror on there that just refuses to believe anything, and that could throw the whole thing in a tailspin. This is a difficult case. We gave the state attorney a commitment that we would work hand in hand with their prosecution team all the way through to the verdict.
As detectives prepare the case for trial, they stumble across another piece of damning evidence.
Back in 2002, Phil Barr was incarcerated in the county jail for unrelated charges to the Tara case. A jail call was then made by Phil Barr to Linda Dilley.
Press 9 to accept.
Hey. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah?
Linda was Phil Barr's girlfriend. She was mad at him as usual about, why he was in jail, and she was mad about the whole thing with Tara.
They just know I know more than what I'm saying. And I totally expect to eventually be arrested for some. And I'm so sick of that girl missing. I hope the girl's laying someplace dead in the middle of the woods, rotting away with ants eating her eyes out.
When we got the tape of the jail call, it was extremely disturbing.
How dare she talk about my daughter like that?
To be quite honestly, really just pissed me off. That tape just fired everybody up.
After hearing the prison phone call, the cold case team takes a closer look at the statements Phil Barr and his girlfriend Linda Dilley gave when Tara vanished. Back in 2001, they both said they were on the phone together throughout the day, making it impossible for Barr to commit murder.
The detectives back then subpoenaed the cell phone records for those 2 numbers, but there was no information about Monday, October 1st on those records. I discovered it was because the service had been terminated for lack of payment and not reestablished by the phone company until October 17th, 16 days after Tara's disappearance. Supposedly, they had talked on the cell phone several times. Clearly, that was a lie. So Linda Dilley was criminally charged with 2 counts of perjury in a capital murder case. She could have done many years in prison.
Linda's attorney approaches the prosecutor, looking for a plea deal, if Linda will agree to testify. The detectives try another approach to persuade her to talk candidly.
I contacted the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico, Virginia. We agreed that we would get 2 female FBI agents, and one of the females was tasked to be more of the caring mom, sister type, and the other one was to be very regimented and more of a law enforcement individual. Linda Dilley consistently said she didn't think Phil Barr had anything to do with Tara's murder.
I pulled a gun on Philip and I told him, if I ever find out you had anything to do with this girl's disappearance, I will pour your out of between your legs and shove it down into your throat. And he never told me the truth.
Linda Dilley was very protective of Phil Barr from the very beginning, and that was part of the character profile that was developed over a period of time based upon input from the Behavioral Analysis Unit. But she started providing us information that she suspected that Phil Barr was involved in illegal drugs right around the time that the Tara case occurred in 2001.
Over 3 days of questioning, the FBI interviewers coax Linda into revealing more about what really happened that day.
There's so many reasons to do that, Linda. You got grandkids. You're looking at jail time. You can unburden yourself, and you can help Tara get justice. You just have to tell us everything that you know.
I do remember it was I. Philip had never, ever, ever done a load of laundry, okay? The man never did it. And I thought that was kind of strange.
She blurted out that she saw a body in the driveway wrapped in a beige sheet. And then when she realized she said that, she instantly had to come up with a reason why that wouldn't be bad for her.
I think they had killed a hog, and I think they was wanting to fit it in my trunk, and I wouldn't let them. But basically, yeah, it would have been a body because it was a hog's body.
Then she talked about how Barr approached her on the 1st or the 2nd of October after the murder and asked her how to get rid of blood and how to get rid of DNA. None of this was ever mentioned to the investigating officers back in 2001.
Subsequently, she made a deal with the state attorney's office to testify against Phil and Dave.
They both deny any involvement and plead not guilty. They're tried separately, with Phil Barr first to face both justice and his former girlfriend. Some 14 years after the murder, a packed courtroom finally hears exactly what happened that awful October day back in 2001.
Our theory is that when they got in the house, Dave kept Tara busy while Phil went into the master bedroom and he stole what he could, put it in his pocket.
I think drugs had something to do with it. I think probably there was a combination of they saw a pretty girl and they needed money for drugs.
Tara probably caught them, confronted them, and we feel she was killed or definitely incapacitated in the house. They panicked, fled the house, and they made a trip or two back to the house to clean up and to get the body.
The jury deliberates for just 90 minutes before returning a verdict.
When I heard the word guilty, just so many emotions again, just of happiness, relief, and I just remember hugging my children and, just like, we did it.
Actually, I was surprised at my reaction because I expected to jump for joy and scream and holler, and I had a little bit of that, but our job wasn't done. We still had one to go.
Dave McManus is tried and convicted 2 years later. Like Barr, he is sentenced to life in prison.
Life without parole. Both of them. And you know what I say? I hope they live to be 100. I hope they think about it every day.
We hugged each other and we were ecstatic. I mean, we couldn't have been happier.
It was a nightmare for a very, very long time. If it wasn't for the cold case unit, I don't believe I would have justice. They will be in my hearts forever.
I was thrilled. These people were taken off the street. Justice was served as much as justice can be served for such a heinous crime.
Victims of cold cases do not deserve to be a box on the shelf. They are human beings. What I'd like to say to other families is never give up hope. Never give up fighting. Do what you have to do to get justice for your loved one. I believe in forgiveness to some extent, but I will never, ever forgive those men for what they did and what they took. They took my soul for a long time. Yeah, they took a lot. But you know what? They'll never take my memories. They're mine.
The call did not come with sirens or flashing lights. It came in the quiet hour before morning, when the hospital corridors smelled of disinfectant and sleep deprivation, when machines breathed for people who no longer could. A nurse dialed a number she had never dialed before, her hand steady but her voice unsure. And when someone answered on the other end, she said only this: a man was dying, and he wanted to talk about a murder from 1990. In a small Georgia county that had learned to live with silence. Those words cut through 3 decades like glass. Cold case, deathbed confession, a past that refused to stay buried. In 1990, the town had been the kind of place where nights were loud with crickets and quiet with certainty. Doors were left unlocked. Names carried histories. People measured time in high school graduations and church anniversaries, not in crimes. The victim had been part of that rhythm. Known, recognizable, predictable in the way small towns rely on. When that predictability shattered, it did so violently. A body discovered where it should not have been. A scene that did not belong. Red and blue lights reflecting off familiar storefronts. Shock traveled faster than facts, and fear settled in before explanations could. Law enforcement moved quickly because that is what the town demanded. Patrol officers became investigators overnight. Detectives worked long hours, fueled by coffee and pressure, trying to impose order on chaos. They knocked on every door, asked the same questions again and again, searching for inconsistencies, for cracks, for anything that would point somewhere definitive. They collected what evidence they could, following procedures that were considered solid at the time, unaware that the future would judge those standards harshly. Everyone assumed the case would resolve. Crimes like that did not linger here. They were aberrations, not mysteries. But the days passed, and clarity never came. Witnesses contradicted one another. A suspicious vehicle turned out to be unrelated. A promising suspect dissolved under scrutiny. Each theory collapsed just short of certainty. The case grew heavier with every failed lead, until eventually it stopped moving altogether. Files were labeled, boxed, and shelved. Detectives reassigned. The word cold was never said out loud at first, but everyone felt it settle in. An unsolved murder is not loud. It is quiet in a way that seeps into daily life, changing it slowly. The family learned to exist inside that quiet. They spoke the victim's name carefully, as if saying it too loudly might make the absence worse. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Investigators called less frequently. Tips slowed, then stopped. The family learned how to nod politely when someone said, "They'll catch whoever did this." They learned how to answer questions without answering them. Waiting became a second language. Years turned into decades. The town grew, shrank, grew again. New people arrived who did not know the story, who walked streets unaware of what had happened there. Older residents carried the memory like a scar, invisible but sensitive. The case surfaced occasionally, usually around anniversaries, usually accompanied by the same unanswered questions. It became a local legend stripped of its urgency, referenced in passing but rarely confronted. Until the hospital call. Detectives who received the message did not celebrate. They did not assume anything. They had seen false confessions before, seen regret masquerade as truth. But they understood the gravity of timing. Deathbed statements have a way of cutting through denial, of loosening tongues that have stayed disciplined for decades. They drove to the hospital without sirens, without ceremony, carrying notebooks that would soon be filled with words no one had heard before. The man in the bed looked smaller than the version they had imagined while driving. Illness had reduced him, but his eyes were alert. He did not ramble. He did not hesitate. He spoke as if reciting something memorized long ago, a story practiced in silence. He named the victim. He described the night. He spoke of fear, of impulse, of a moment that could not be taken back. Details emerged that had never been public. Specifics that aligned too closely with the old file to dismiss outright. Detectives asked questions carefully, aware that every prompt could shape a response. They let him talk, let pauses stretch, let the weight of what he was saying fill the room. When they left, they did not promise anything. They did not offer absolution. They carried the confession with them like something fragile and dangerous, something that could either unlock the truth or explode under scrutiny. Back at the station, the past came off the shelves. Boxes were opened, evidence logs reread, photographs examined under new light. The confession acted like a filter, making some details suddenly glow while others faded. An overlooked timeline aligned differently. A witness statement dismissed as unreliable now seemed cautious, not confused. Patterns began to form, tentative but compelling. Word spread, slowly at first. A reporter heard a whisper. A former officer received a call. The phrase Georgia 1990 cold case appeared again, this time paired with deathbed confession. The town felt it immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People searched their memories, wondering what they had seen, what they had ignored, what they had chosen not to say. The past, long dormant, was awake. The victim's family was informed privately. There were no dramatic reactions, no public statements. Just silence, heavy and layered. Hope arrived tangled with dread. A confession promised answers, but it also threatened to reopen wounds that had never fully healed. Closure, they knew, was not guaranteed. It never is. As investigators worked, reality asserted itself. Evidence had aged. Some items were missing. Some witnesses were dead. Others were hard to find, reluctant to revisit a past they had worked hard to forget. The confession, powerful as it was, could not stand alone. It had to be tested, challenged, supported by something solid. Every step forward risked exposing how much time had eroded. Then the man died. No charges, no trial, just a confession recorded and preserved, its source gone. The town reacted in fragments. Some felt robbed of justice. Others felt a grim satisfaction, convinced the truth had finally been spoken, even if consequences were incomplete. The case entered a new, unstable phase, suspended between resolution and uncertainty. But the investigation did not stop. It couldn't. The confession had reopened doors that could not be closed again. Associates were questioned. Old locations revisited. Modern forensic techniques were applied to evidence collected in an era that could not have imagined them. Slowly, painstakingly, the narrative tightened. What had once been speculation began to look like structure. The town watched, divided between those who wanted finality and those who feared what finality might reveal. Old friendships strained under the weight of suspicion. Familiar faces were re-examined through an uncomfortable lens. Memory itself became unreliable, reshaped by new information layered onto old beliefs. Through it all, one truth became unavoidable. The case had never really been cold. It had been waiting for a moment when silence could no longer hold, waiting for a voice weakened by time but freed by it, waiting for the past to demand attention again. And as the investigation pressed forward, carrying the weight of 30 years and the echo of a dying confession, the town was forced to confront something it had avoided since 1990. Some crimes do not fade. They age. They sink into the foundations of a place. And when they surface again, they do not arrive gently. They arrive with questions that cannot be ignored and answers that change everything that comes after. The morning after the confession spread beyond the station walls, the town woke up uneasy, as if something heavy had shifted in the night. Coffee tasted different. Conversation stalled. People checked their phones before stepping out of their houses, scanning headlines that hadn't fully formed yet, but already felt inevitable. Georgia, 1990. Cold case solved? No one knew which words would stick, only that the past had forced its way back into the present, loud and unapologetic. Inside the sheriff's office, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. Detectives moved with purpose, quieter than usual, aware that every action now carried weight beyond procedure. The confession transcript sat on the table, marked, annotated, read so many times the pages had softened. Each sentence was treated like evidence itself, not because it came from a dying man, but because of what it unlocked. Names, places, motives that aligned too cleanly to ignore. They returned to the beginning, to the night in 1990 when the call first came in. The victim's last known movements were mapped again, this time with a sharper pencil. The bar on the edge of town, the dim parking lot, the argument someone claimed to overhear but couldn't describe clearly enough back then. At the time, it had been noise. Now it sounded like context. Detectives re-interviewed witnesses who were still alive, approaching them carefully, without accusation. Some were cooperative, relieved to finally speak openly. Others were defensive, their memories fogged by time or willful forgetting. A few reacted with visible fear, the kind that doesn't come from being questioned, but from being reminded. 30 years is a long time to carry something you hoped would never resurface. One witness, long dismissed as unreliable, now sat straighter in their chair, emboldened by the knowledge that the silence was breaking. They repeated what they had said decades earlier, but this time they added something new. A detail they had been afraid to share back then. A name they thought would bring trouble. The room went still as detectives exchanged glances. It was a name already mentioned in the confession. The victim's family followed the developments from a distance, shielded when possible, exposed when unavoidable. Reporters called. Old acquaintances resurfaced with condolences that felt rehearsed. They listened to updates with guarded expressions, knowing better than to let hope rise unchecked. Closure had been promised before. This time felt different, but different did not always mean better. As evidence was re-examined, technology filled gaps that had once been insurmountable. DNA swabs taken with outdated methods were retested. Fibers preserved in plastic bags were analyzed with precision unimaginable in 1990. Not every test yielded results, but enough did to build momentum. Each small confirmation tightened the narrative, reinforcing the confession instead of contradicting it. The man who had confessed became more than a name. His history was pulled apart, not to vilify, but to understand. Where he had been in 1990, who he had known, what pressures he had lived under. Patterns emerged, subtle but disturbing. A temper documented in fragments. Conflicts minimized at the time, now reevaluated through a harsher lens. Nothing alone proved guilt. Together, they form a picture that was hard to dismiss. The town began to divide along quiet lines. Some people accepted the confession immediately, eager to believe the mystery was finally solved. Others resisted, questioning motives, timing, credibility. Why now? Why wait until death? Was this truth or an attempt to control the narrative one last time? Those questions echoed in diners, in church parking lots, in living rooms where the television stayed on longer than usual. Law enforcement felt the pressure, but they did not rush. A confession without corroboration was not justice. It was a story, powerful but incomplete. They needed to be certain, not for headlines, but for history. This case would be remembered long after they were gone. It demanded patience. As weeks passed, a second thread began to surface. Not another suspect, but another silence. Someone who had known more than they admitted. Someone who had benefited from the case going cold. When detectives approached them, the reaction was immediate and telling. Defensive, evasive, angry. The kind of response that didn't match innocence or guilt cleanly, but something in between. Fear of implication, perhaps, or fear of exposure. Interviews grew longer. Questions sharper. Timelines tighter. The town noticed. Unmarked cars appeared on familiar streets. People were seen entering the station and leaving with their heads down. The phrase cold case no longer felt distant. It felt local again, immediate, invasive. Meanwhile, the victim's name returned to public consciousness, no longer attached only to tragedy, but to persistence. Friends share memories online. Old photographs circulated. The person behind the crime resurfaced, reminding everyone what had been lost. That alone shifted the tone. This was no longer just about who did it. It was about what had been taken and how long it had been denied. One evening, detectives revisited the original crime scene, now transformed by time. Buildings replaced trees. Pavement covered ground that once held answers. They stood there anyway, letting the confession guide their perspective, imagining movement, intent, panic. Sometimes, understanding comes not from evidence, but from immersion, from standing where history fractured and letting it speak. The confession, once static, began to feel alive, interacting with the present. Details matched weather reports from that night. A timeline aligned with an old receipt. A seemingly minor inconsistency was resolved by a forgotten witness statement. Each alignment strengthened the case. Not legally perhaps, but morally. Truth has a weight that grows heavier the more it is supported. Still, questions remained. About motive. About why the victim had been there. About whether others knew and stayed silent. Cold cases rarely resolve cleanly. They unravel, exposing more than just one act. They reveal a culture of fear, of loyalty misplaced, of moments when people chose comfort over truth. As investigators prepared their findings for the district attorney, they understood the complexity ahead. The suspect was dead. Prosecution was impossible, but accountability was not. Officially closing the case meant naming what had happened, documenting it, refusing to let it remain ambiguous. That mattered. To the family, to the town, to the record. The community braced itself. Town meetings grew crowded. Voices rose. Some demanded names. Others demanded restraint. Everyone wanted certainty, but certainty is a rare currency in cases like this. What they would get instead was clarity, and clarity can be just as disruptive. The cold case was no longer dormant. It was active, volatile, reshaping relationships and memories alike. And as the investigation moved closer to its conclusion, one thing became clear to everyone watching. The truth, once stirred, does not settle quietly. It demands acknowledgement. It demands space. And it leaves behind consequences that ripple far beyond the moment it is spoken. By the time the district attorney's office formally acknowledged the renewed investigation, the town had already crossed an invisible threshold. There was no going back to the comfort of not knowing. The phrase Georgia 1990 cold case began appearing in local broadcasts, spoken cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, each repetition chiseling away at decades of uncertainty. What had once been an old wound, quietly ignored, was now open again, examined under harsh fluorescent light. Inside the evidence room, cardboard boxes marked with fading ink were pulled from shelves that hadn't been touched in years. The smell of dust and aging paper filled the air. Detectives handled each item carefully, aware that they were not just handling objects, but fragments of a life interrupted. A wallet, a jacket, Photographs taken under pressure, framed poorly, never meant to last this long. Each item told a partial story, incomplete on its own, but louder when placed beside the confession. The confession itself was dissected line by line, not with reverence, but with skepticism sharpened by experience. Investigators looked for cracks, moments where the narrative might have been borrowed from public knowledge rather than lived memory. Yet the deeper they went, the more unsettling the alignment became. The confessor described sensations, not just actions. The smell of oil in the air, the sound of gravel under hurried footsteps, details that had never been made public, details that had no reason to exist unless they were remembered. Still, memory can deceive. Detectives knew that better than anyone. So they searched for something colder, something indifferent to time and guilt. Physical proof, a link that could not be rationalized away. When the lab results began to return, one by one, the case shifted again. Partial DNA profiles, trace evidence, not enough for a courtroom battle, but enough to anchor the confession in reality, enough to silence some doubts and amplify others. The victim's final hours were reconstructed with painful precision. Who they spoke to, where they paused, what they might have felt, walking unaware toward the moment that would define the next 30 years of someone else's life. Investigators avoided speculation in their reports, but privately, they couldn't help imagining the fear, the confusion, the sudden realization that something was wrong. That realization echoed through every document, every testimony, every sleepless night spent chasing the truth. As the narrative took shape, so did resistance. Not from the suspect, who was beyond consequence, but from those left behind. Family members of the deceased confessor pushed back publicly, questioning the integrity of the investigation, accusing law enforcement of exploiting a dead man to close a case. Their anger was raw, understandable, and inconvenient. Grief does not follow legal timelines. It erupts when least welcome. Town officials urged calm, but calm was no longer an option. Social media became a battleground of memory and denial. Old rumors resurfaced, reshaped into accusations. People scrutinized each other's pasts, searching for clues they might have missed. In a town this small, everyone had known everyone else at some point. That intimacy now felt dangerous, like a map of potential betrayal. Detectives remained focused, but the emotional toll was evident. This was no longer just a job. It was a reckoning. Some had grown up hearing about the case, whispering about it as teenagers. Now, they were tasked with defining it, with deciding how history would remember what happened. That responsibility weighed heavier than any badge. One afternoon, a new witness came forward. Not someone unknown, but someone overlooked. They had been young in 1990, dismissed as unreliable, too emotional, too close to the victim. Now older, steadier, they spoke with a clarity that surprised even themselves. They described a conversation they had overheard days before the murder, words that made no sense at the time, but now rang with ominous clarity. The name mentioned matched the confession again. Another coincidence, another thread tightening. The district attorney listened carefully, knowing the limitations of what could be done. No arrest, no trial, no verdict handed down in a courtroom packed with reporters. What they could offer instead was acknowledgement, a formal statement of responsibility, a closure that was symbolic rather than punitive. For some, that was enough. For others, it would never be. As preparations began for a public announcement, debates erupted behind closed doors. How much to reveal? How to phrase it? Whether naming the confessor officially would bring healing or harm. Legal advisors warned of defamation concerns. Community leaders warned of unrest. Victim advocates warned of silence. Every choice carried risk. Meanwhile, the victim's family prepared in private. They revisited memories long buried, sorting through photographs and letters, deciding which version of their loved one they wanted the world to see. Not just a headline, not just a case number, a person. They asked questions they had never dared to voice before. Why that night? Why that place? Why no one had come sooner? The investigation's final report grew thicker, heavier, its pages dense with analysis and restraint. It avoided dramatic language, but the weight of its conclusions was undeniable. The evidence supported the confession. The timeline matched. The opportunity was clear. While absolute certainty remained elusive, the preponderance of facts pointed in one direction. The cold case was no longer cold. It was resolved as much as it ever could be. On the eve of the announcement, the town felt suspended in anticipation. Streetlights hummed. Windows glowed. People lay awake, rehearsing reactions they might soon need. Some hoped for vindication. Others feared exposure. Everyone sensed that the next day would redraw the emotional landscape of the community. When a statement was finally released, it was measured, careful, unmistakable. The district attorney acknowledged the confession, the corroborating evidence, the conclusion reached after renewed investigation. The words "cold case" solved appeared in print, stark and definitive. There was no celebration, no applause, just a collective exhale, followed by a deeper breath of uncertainty. Reactions were immediate and divided. Some praised law enforcement for their persistence. Others accused them of settling for convenience. The family of the victims spoke briefly, their words trembling but firm, expressing relief not because justice had been served, but because truth had been spoken aloud. Silence, they said, had been the cruelest part. The confession, once a private moment between a dying man and a detective, had now become part of the public record. It could no longer be denied or hidden. It belonged to everyone, and that ownership came with discomfort. People revisited their memories of the confessor, reevaluating smiles, gestures, moments that now felt tainted. The past reshaped itself, quietly, relentlessly. As the dust began to settle, investigators returned to their routines, changed but unresolved. Cold cases rarely end cleanly. They linger, leaving questions that no report can answer. But this one had crossed a line from mystery into meaning. It had forced a reckoning, not just with a crime, but with time itself. And in that reckoning, the town learned something unsettling yet unavoidable. The past does not fade. It waits, patient, silent, until someone, somewhere, decides to finally speak. The morning after the announcement, the town woke up heavier than before, as if the air itself had absorbed the words "cold case," solved, and refused to let them dissipate. Coffee tasted bitter. Radio stayed on longer than usual. People lingered in driveways, talking in low voices, trying to align their private memories with the official version now stamped into history. Resolution, it turned out, did not bring peace. It brought noise. At the sheriff's office, phones rang without pause. Some callers offered thanks, voices trembling with relief. Others demanded explanations, their anger sharp, almost accusatory. Why now? Why this man? Why trust a deathbed confession when there would never be cross-examination, never a chance to challenge it in open court? Detectives listened, absorbing the frustration, knowing there were no answers that could satisfy everyone. Cold cases don't close like doors. They crack, leaving splinters behind. Behind the scenes, the investigative team continued working, not because they had to, but because stopping felt wrong. The case file, though officially concluded, was still open on desks, its pages marked with notes and sticky tabs. Old habits die hard, especially when built over decades of unanswered questions. One detective stared at a grainy photograph of the crime scene, noticing details he had overlooked for years. A shadow near the tree line, tire impressions partially obscured by mud. Clues that once seemed insignificant now pulsed with renewed meaning. The confession had answered the central question of who, but it had sharpened every question of how and why. Why that specific night? Why that isolated stretch of road? Why a crime that appeared both impulsive and strangely deliberate? The confessor's words offered fragments, but fragments leave space for interpretation, and interpretation breeds doubt. Investigators debated internally, replaying the narrative, testing its strength against every known fact. Outside the station, the media descended in waves. Satellite trucks lined the streets. Reporters repeated phrases like stunning revelation and deathbed confession, compressing 30 years of pain into sound bites designed for maximum impact. Each broadcast amplified the story, pushing it far beyond the town's boundaries. Suddenly, strangers across the state had opinions about a crime they had never lived with, never whispered about in grocery store aisles or church pews. For the victim's family, the attention was suffocating. They had waited decades for truth, not for spectacle. Cameras hovered outside their home. Journalists requested interviews, promising sensitivity while fishing for emotion. Some family members refused outright, retreating into privacy. Others felt compelled to speak, believing that silence had already stolen too much. When they did, their words were careful, restrained, shaped by years of restraint. They spoke of a life, not a headline, a laugh, a habit, a future that had vanished without explanation. As days passed, another layer of complexity emerged. Former witnesses, long dismissed or forgotten, began coming forward. Memory, triggered by headlines and repetition, can be unreliable, but can also unlock doors long sealed. One man recalled seeing a vehicle near the scene that matched the confessor's description. A woman remembered a heated argument weeks before the crime. Voices raised, tension palpable. None of it was enough to change the conclusion, but it added texture, depth, a sense that the truth had always been there, scattered and ignored. Within the legal community, debate intensified. Prosecutors discussed whether a posthumous finding of responsibility carried ethical weight. Defense attorneys warned of precedent, arguing that naming a deceased suspect risked eroding standards of proof. Academics weighed in, framing the case as a study in delayed justice and moral responsibility. The cold case became a talking point, a symbol, stripped of its local specificity and repurposed for broader arguments about the justice system's limits. Yet for those who had lived with it, the case was never abstract. It was personal, visceral. A retired detective, now living quietly miles away, watched the coverage with mixed emotions. He remembered knocking on doors in 1990, asking questions no one wanted to answer. He remembered the exhaustion, the frustration, the gradual realization that the trail had gone cold. Seeing the case resolved stirred pride and regret in equal measure. Pride that truth had finally surfaced. Regret that it hadn't happened sooner. In the town's cemetery, flowers appeared at the victim's grave for the first time in years. Some were placed by family, others by strangers, people who felt compelled to acknowledge a loss they had only recently come to understand. The gesture was quiet, respectful, almost apologetic, as if the community itself were saying what it had never known how to say before. Meanwhile, the family of the confessor grappled with a different reality. Their grief collided with shame, disbelief, and anger. They issued statements disputing the findings, emphasizing the absence of a trial, the impossibility of defense. Friends rallied around them, insisting that the man they knew was incapable of such violence. The town split again, lines drawn not by evidence, but by loyalty and memory. Detectives anticipated this fracture. They had seen it before. Closure for one side often reopens wounds for another. In meetings, they discussed the long-term impact, the potential for resentment to linger, for old grudges to harden into something more corrosive. Community leaders organized forums, inviting dialogue, urging empathy. Attendance was mixed. Some wanted to talk. Others wanted to forget. As weeks turned into months, the story slowly slipped from national headlines, replaced by newer shocks, newer crimes. But locally, its echo persisted. High school students studied the case in civics classes, examining the timeline, the evidence, the confession. Teachers emphasized critical thinking, reminding students that justice is rarely neat. The cold case became a lesson, not just in crime, but in patience, in consequence, in the weight of unanswered questions. For the investigative team, the final act was documentation. Every note, every interview, every lab result was archived with meticulous care. They knew future eyes might review their work, searching for flaws, for missed opportunities. Transparency was their defense. They had followed the evidence as far as it would lead, even when that path ended without handcuffs or a courtroom verdict. Late one evening, a detective returned alone to the evidence room. He stood before the now reorganized shelves, the boxes neatly labeled, the chaos of decades reduced to order. He thought about time, about how it distorts memory, but preserves truth in unexpected ways. He thought about the confession, whispered at the edge of life, and about the silence that had preceded it. The case had been solved, officially, but solving did not mean erasing. It meant living with the knowledge, carrying it forward, allowing it to reshape understanding of the past. The town would never be the same, and perhaps it shouldn't be. Cold cases are reminders that time does not heal all wounds. Sometimes it only delays the pain. As the lights dimmed in the sheriff's office, the detective closed the file one last time. Outside, the town settled into uneasy quiet, aware now that even the longest silence can be broken, and that when it is, the sound can echo longer than anyone expects. Time moved forward, but not cleanly. It dragged the case behind it like a shadow that refused to detach, stretching across conversations, routines, and dreams. Months after the announcement, the phrase Georgia 1990 cold case still surfaced uninvited, whispered in diners, murmured during sermons, typed into search bars late at night. The confession had ended the investigation, but it had ignited something else entirely, a reckoning with memory, with guilt, with the uncomfortable realization that the truth had lived among them all along. Inside the sheriff's office, the atmosphere shifted from urgency to vigilance. Detectives no longer chased leads, but they monitored reactions. Anonymous letters arrived, some praising the work, others questioning it with near hostile intensity. A few claimed to possess additional information, fragments that suddenly felt important now that the central mystery had been named. Each letter was logged, each claim evaluated, not because the case needed reopening, but because unresolved crimes tend to attract unresolved minds. One envelope contained a single page, handwritten, shaky, but deliberate. It described a night drive in the early 1990s, headlights cutting through rural darkness, a car parked at an odd angle near the road. The writer claimed fear had kept them silent for decades. The details were maddeningly vague, impossible to verify, yet disturbingly plausible. Detectives read it twice, then a third time, aware that certainty was a luxury cold cases rarely afford. The confession itself began to take on a life of its own. Transcripts circulated online, stripped of context, quoted selectively. Some readers treated it as gospel. Others dismissed it as a dying man's fantasy, a desperate bid for attention. Armchair analysts dissected phrasing, tone, pauses, as if meaning could be extracted from punctuation. The town watched as its private trauma became public debate, its pain transformed into content. For the victim's family, this phase was the hardest. They had imagined closure as a clean line drawn between past and present. Instead, it felt like standing at the center of a storm, pulled in opposing directions by strangers' opinions. Therapy sessions multiplied. Old photographs resurfaced, not out of nostalgia, but necessity. They needed to remember the person before the crime, before the decades of waiting hollowed out those memories and replaced them with anger. One family member described it as grief with an echo. The initial loss in 1990 had been sharp, immediate. This loss was slower, heavier, filled with what-ifs. What if the confession had come earlier? What if someone had spoken up sooner? What if the system had been better equipped to listen? These questions had no answers, only weight. Community leaders attempted to channel the tension into something constructive. Town halls were organized, framed as spaces for healing rather than debate. Attendance varied. Some residents came ready to speak, voices trembling with long-suppressed stories. Others sat in silence, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. A few stayed away entirely, unwilling to reopen wounds they had learned to live with. At one meeting, an elderly woman stood and admitted she had suspected the confessor years ago, but dismissed the thought as paranoia. Her admission landed heavily, not as an accusation, but as a confession of her own. The room absorbed it in stunned quiet. No one blamed her. Blame, by then, felt pointless. But the acknowledgement hung in the air, proof that intuition without evidence is a fragile thing. The legal aftermath unfolded slowly. Though there would be no trial, prosecutors prepared a comprehensive report, documenting how the confession aligned with physical evidence, witness statements, and timeline inconsistencies that had plagued the case for decades. The document was exhaustive, almost defensive, as if anticipating skepticism before it arrived. When released, it satisfied some critics and enraged others. Transparency, it seemed, could not guarantee acceptance. National crime analysts weighed in, framing the case as emblematic of a broader pattern. Crime solved too late for traditional justice, relying on conscience rather than courtrooms. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to the story, narrators speaking in hushed tones, building suspense around moments the town had lived through in real time. For listeners, it was entertainment. For locals, it was intrusion. Yet amid the noise, something subtle began to change. The case sparked renewed interest in other unresolved crimes across the state. Tips poured into cold case units, some credible, others born of coincidence or imagination. Resources were reallocated. Files long untouched were reopened, dust brushed from evidence bags, old photographs scanned into new systems. The ripple effect was undeniable. One confession had reactivated an entire philosophy of investigation. Veteran detectives mentored younger officers, using the case as a teaching tool. They emphasized patience, documentation, and the importance of preserving evidence even when hope seems irrational. They spoke candidly about mistakes, about assumptions that had narrowed focus too early. These conversations were raw, unpolished, driven by the knowledge that future cases might depend on lessons learned too late for this one. The town itself adjusted in small, almost imperceptible ways. Memorials were updated. A scholarship fund was established in the victim's name, quietly at first, then with growing support. The gesture wasn't about redemption. It was about continuity, about ensuring the name associated with tragedy would also be linked to opportunity. Still, nights were restless. Residents reported dreams where timelines blurred, where the past intruded without warning. Some dreamed of unanswered questions, others of confrontations that never happened. Trauma, psychologists explained, does not require direct involvement. Proximity is enough. Living near a mystery for 30 years leaves residue. The confessor's grave became a site of contention. Some believed it should remain untouched, a private place for family grief. Others argued it symbolized accountability, that the truth buried their deserved acknowledgement. No official stance was taken. The cemetery stayed quiet, its significance shaped by those who visited and those who avoided it. As the first anniversary of the announcement approached, the sheriff's office prepared a brief statement, acknowledging the date without reopening debate. It was factual, restrained, almost clinical. But beneath the words lay recognition of endurance. Cold cases don't end when answers appear. They end when communities learn how to live with those answers. On the anniversary night, a candlelight vigil was held, unpublicized, organized by residents rather than officials. There were no speeches, no media, just light against darkness. Faces illuminated briefly before fading back into shadow. The silence felt deliberate, earned. In that quiet, the case revealed its final truth. Resolution is not an event. It is a process. It unfolds unevenly, shaped by memory, resistance, and the slow recalibration of trust. The Georgia 1990 cold case had been solved on paper, but in reality, it continued to work its way through the lives it had touched, altering them in ways both visible and unseen. And somewhere between acceptance and doubt, between relief and regret, the town settled into a new understanding. The past could not be changed, but could be faced, even after 30 years, even after silence, even after death. The second year after the confession arrived without ceremony, but it carried a different weight. The shock had faded, replaced by something more complex, more unsettling. Acceptance did not mean agreement. Understanding did not mean forgiveness. The Georgia 1990 cold case had moved from headline to history, yet it refused to settle quietly into the past. It lingered, reshaping how the town understood itself, how it remembered silence, how it defined responsibility. Inside homes, conversations shifted tone. Parents spoke more openly to their children about fear, about trust, about the cost of keeping secrets. Names that had once been avoided now surfaced cautiously, surrounded by qualifiers and hesitation. Allegedly, according to the report, language became armor, a way to speak without fully committing to belief. Even now, certainty felt dangerous. At the sheriff's office, the case continued to echo in unexpected ways. Cold case investigators from neighboring counties requested briefings, not just on the confession, but on the years before it. They wanted to know where momentum had stalled, how promising leads had dissolved into nothing. The meetings were candid, sometimes uncomfortably so. Detectives admitted tunnel vision. They admitted fatigue. They admitted how easy it had been, after years without progress, to stop expecting answers at all. Those admissions mattered. They shifted the narrative from blame to accountability, from accusation to examination. The case was no longer just about one crime, one victim, one confession. It became a mirror held up to the system itself, reflecting its strengths and its failures with equal clarity. The victim's family felt that shift acutely. They were invited to speak at law enforcement conferences to share the human cost of delay. Standing at podiums far from home, they told their story not as an appeal for sympathy, but as evidence. Evidence that unresolved cases don't fade. They metastasize. They seep into marriages, into childhoods, into identities. Each year, without answers compounds the damage. After one such talk, a young detective approached them, eyes downcast, voice unsteady. He said he had recently reopened a case older than his own career, inspired by their words. He said he didn't know if he would succeed. He just knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. The family listened, nodded, and for the first time since the confession, felt something close to purpose. Back home, the town remained divided, though the lines were less visible now. Open arguments gave way to quiet distance. People who once shared tables avoided eye contact. Others, surprising everyone, reconciled, united by exhaustion rather than agreement. Time has a way of sanding down sharp edges, even when the core remains unresolved. The confessor's recorded words continued to haunt those who listened closely. Analysts noted inconsistencies not in facts, but in emotion. Moments where remorse sounded rehearsed. Others where pain seemed genuine, almost raw. Psychologists debated whether truth requires sincerity, whether guilt can coexist with self-deception. The answers, like the case itself, resisted finality. A former investigator revisited the original interrogation tapes from the early 1990s, listening through modern headphones, catching nuances lost to outdated equipment decades earlier. He noticed pauses, subtle hesitations, questions never asked because the moment passed too quickly. It wasn't evidence of wrongdoing. It was evidence of humanity, flawed and finite. Investigations are conducted by people, not machines, and people miss things. This realization softened some of the town's harsher judgments. The narrative shifted again from outrage to reflection. Could anyone truly say they would have done better, armed only with the tools and knowledge of that time? The question lingered unanswered, uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the physical landscape of the crime scene began to change. Development crept closer. Trees were cleared. Roads widened. What had once been an isolated stretch of land transformed into something almost ordinary. For longtime residents, the change felt disorienting. How could a place of such darkness look so unremarkable? How could horror leave so little trace? A small plaque was proposed, modest and unassuming, not to mark the crime, but to acknowledge the life lost. The proposal sparked debate. Some argued it would reopen wounds. Others believed forgetting was the greater harm. In the end, the plaque was installed quietly, without ceremony, its text simple, almost stark. No names of perpetrators. No timelines. Just remembrance. As seasons turned, the case continued to influence behavior in subtle ways. People locked doors they once left open. Parents waited longer in parking lots. Trust became something granted cautiously, revoked easily. The confession had revealed not just a crime, but a vulnerability. The realization that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it blends in. The sheriff's office implemented new protocols inspired directly by the case. Evidence retention policies were strengthened. Interagency databases expanded. Anonymous tip lines were modernized, designed to lower the psychological barrier to coming forward. The changes were incremental, bureaucratic, unglamorous. But they mattered. They were the quiet legacy of a crime solved too late. On the anniversary of the victim's birth, the family gathered privately, away from cameras and crowds. They spoke her name aloud, shared stories unconnected to her death. For a few hours, the case loosened its grip, allowing memory to breathe. Grief, they had learned, does not shrink. It integrates. It becomes part of the landscape. Yet even in these moments, the unanswered lingered. Why had the tip that ultimately led to resolution come so late? What shifted in the confessor's final years that silence could no longer hold? Was it guilt, fear, clarity, or something else entirely? No one could say. Motive, like truth, can fracture under scrutiny. Late one night, a retired journalist who had covered the case from the beginning reread his old notebooks. He was struck by how certain he had sounded back then, how confident in theories now proven wrong. The realization unsettled him. Certainty, he understood now, is seductive. It simplifies complexity. It comforts, but can also blind. He wrote a final piece, not about the crime, but about doubt, about the necessity of leaving space for what we don't know. The article didn't go viral. It wasn't dramatic enough, but those who read it felt its weight. As the years since the confession accumulated, the town reached a fragile equilibrium. The case no longer dominated daily life, but shaped the town's moral architecture. Silence was no longer neutral. Delay was no longer invisible. The Georgia 1990 cold case had taught a lesson that extended beyond crime. That truth has a cost, whether it arrives early or late. And still, on certain nights when the roads were empty and the air felt heavy, people thought about that phone call, that confession whispered at the edge of death. They wondered how many other truths were still waiting, suspended in time, dependent on chance, courage, or the slow erosion of fear. The case had ended officially, but its influence continued, moving quietly through systems, relationships, and memories. A reminder that justice is not a moment. It is a process, uneven and imperfect, shaped by human limits. And sometimes, even when answers finally come, the real reckoning is just beginning. By the time the third year settled in, the case had become something quieter but no less potent, like a low-frequency hum beneath daily life. You didn't hear it unless you listened for it, but once you did, it was impossible to ignore. The Georgia 1990 cold case no longer erupted in arguments or headlines. It whispered instead, threading itself through routine moments, altering reactions, shaping instincts in ways most people couldn't articulate. The sheriff's office noticed it first in patterns. Tips for unrelated cases arrived faster, more detailed, more urgent. People no longer waited weeks to speak up. They called the same night. They emailed photographs. They apologized for hesitating at all. Fear hadn't disappeared, but it had been reframed. Silence now carried a visible consequence, and that knowledge changed behavior. Detectives adjusted their approach accordingly. Interviews became slower, more deliberate. They allowed witnesses time to circle their memories instead of forcing linear answers. Trauma, they had learned, does not move in straight lines. The Georgia case had taught them that urgency without patience can be just another form of blindness. At the same time, doubt continued to gnaw at the edges of certainty. Not about whether the crime occurred or whether harm had been done, but about whether the story told at the end was complete. Completion, after all, is a concept humans invented to make sense of chaos. Reality rarely cooperates. A university criminology department requested access to anonymized files, hoping to study the psychological arc of delayed confession. Their research focused not on guilt, but on endurance. What allows someone to carry a secret for decades? What finally breaks that silence? The findings were inconclusive, layered with caveats and contradictions. Human motivation, the researchers concluded, is resistant to clean explanation. One theory suggested proximity to death alters perception of consequence. Another argued that confession is not about absolution, but control, a final attempt to shape narrative. Both explanations unsettled the victim's family. Neither offered comfort. They didn't want theory. They wanted something solid, something that could anchor 30 years of waiting. But anchors are rare in cases like this. The confessor's voice recordings, preserved and archived, were rarely played now. Too many listens had stripped them of shock, leaving behind only texture. The rasp of breath, the pauses, the subtle shifts in tone. For some investigators, those details became obsessive. They listened for deception, for clarity, for meaning hidden between words. What they found instead was ambiguity, relentless and unyielding. Ambiguity seeped into public memory as well. The story, once sharp-edged, grew rounded by retelling. Details blurred. Dates shifted. In some versions, the crime became simpler than it was. In others, more elaborate. This distortion troubled those closest to the truth. They understood how myths form, how complexity erodes under repetition. The case, they feared, might one day be remembered inaccurately, its lessons diluted. To counter that, a local archivist began compiling a comprehensive oral history. She recorded interviews with investigators, family members, journalists, even residents who had lived near the crime scene. The goal was not consensus, but preservation. Multiple truths, side by side, unflattened. The process was slow, emotionally draining. Some interviewees broke down mid-sentence. Others spoke with startling calm, as if distance had finally numbed the pain. When asked why she took on the project, the archivist answered simply. Forgetting, she said, is the most efficient way to repeat mistakes. Meanwhile, the physical evidence, once the silent backbone of the case, became an object of almost reverent attention. Items that had sat untouched for decades were re-examined under new protocols, not because they might change the outcome, but because they represented the discipline of care. Evidence, after all, outlives interpretation. It waits. The town council debated whether to incorporate the case into local historical materials. Some argued it was part of the town's identity now, inseparable from its narrative. Others worried it would define the community solely by tragedy. In the end, they chose a middle path, acknowledgement without spectacle. A single paragraph in the official history. No images, no dramatization, just fact. For younger residents, those born long after 1990, the case felt distant, almost abstract. Yet its influence reached them nonetheless. They grew up in a town shaped by a crime they never witnessed, absorbing caution and vigilance as cultural inheritance. When they asked questions, answers came carefully filtered through years of processing. Adults struggled to explain how something so old could still feel unfinished. In private moments, some residents admitted the confession had forced them to re-examine their own moral thresholds. What would they have done with suspicion and no proof? How long could they carry uncertainty without speaking? The case became less about one man's guilt and more about collective responsibility, about the fragile line between minding one's business and protecting others. The victim's family continued to navigate this evolving landscape with measured resolve. They declined most interview requests now, choosing instead to invest energy in advocacy. They worked with lawmakers to support funding for cold case units, emphasizing that time is not neutral. It degrades memory, erodes evidence, exhausts hope. Their arguments were grounded not in anger, but in lived experience. One bill passed quietly, without fanfare, allocating resources for long-term evidence preservation. It was a small victory, symbolic more than transformative, but it mattered. Policy, like justice, often advances incrementally, carried forward by stories that refuse to fade. The confessor's name appeared less frequently in conversation. The focus shifted slowly back to the victim. Memorial events centered on her life rather than her death. Music she loved, causes she supported. For the family, this shift felt like reclaiming ground stolen by years of speculation. She was more than a case, more than a headline, more than a resolution delayed. And yet, in the quiet hours, doubt still returned. Not accusatory, not aggressive, just present. What if something had been missed? What if the confession, while true in essence, concealed details that mattered? What if closure had arrived wearing a convincing disguise? These thoughts surfaced unbidden, especially at night, when certainty feels weakest. Investigators acknowledged this privately. They understood that no conclusion is immune to scrutiny, but they also understood the cost of endless re-examination. At some point, the pursuit of perfect certainty can become its own form of paralysis. The challenge was knowing when to stop digging and when to leave the earth disturbed. As autumn approached, the town hosted a small remembrance walk. No banners, no speeches, just footsteps along a familiar route, retracing space rather than time. Participation was voluntary. Attendance was modest. But those who came felt the weight of collective acknowledgement, a shared understanding that something irrevocable had occurred here, and that remembering it mattered. In the end, the Georgia 1990 cold case did not offer a clean moral arc. It offered something messier, more human, a story of delay and disclosure, of courage arriving too late and still making a difference. A reminder that justice is not a switch that flips, but a current that moves unevenly, sometimes disappearing underground before resurfacing. The case no longer demanded attention. It commanded respect. And in that quiet respect, the town continued forward, changed not by certainty, but by awareness. Knowing now that silence has weight, that time does not erase responsibility, and that even when the truth finally speaks, it never speaks alone. By the fourth year, the case no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like scar tissue, tough, sensitive, and permanently present. The Georgia 1990 cold case had settled into the town's long memory, not as a solved puzzle, but as a lesson etched into daily behavior. People didn't speak of it often, but when they did, their voices dropped instinctively, as if volume alone could disturb something fragile. The sheriff's office marked the passage of time with quiet diligence. New detectives rotated in, trained on updated protocols shaped by the case's long arc. They studied timelines not to memorize facts, but to understand failure points, where assumptions hardened, where communication faltered, where urgency eclipsed empathy. The case had become a living curriculum, a reminder that investigation is as much about listening as it is about logic. In the evidence wing, climate-controlled and dimly lit, the artifacts of the case remained untouched but not forgotten. Every few months, a supervisor audited the inventory, verifying seals, checking logs, reaffirming the discipline that had grown out of past neglect. Evidence doesn't speak, the veterans like to say. It waits. The waiting, they now understood, is a responsibility. The broader legal community continued to wrestle with the implications of a solved case without a trial. Law reviews published essays questioning whether justice can exist without adjudication. Some argued that truth alone is insufficient, that without confrontation, without verdict, closure is an illusion. Others countered that insisting on courtroom rituals when there are impossible risks elevating procedure over reality. The debate was academic, but its echoes reached the town, where people lived with the outcome every day. For the victim's family, the fourth year brought a different kind of exhaustion. The adrenaline of resolution had faded, leaving behind a steady ache. They had learned to navigate anniversaries with precision, choosing when to engage, when to retreat. Public remembrance had its place, but private grief demanded privacy. They found solace in routine, shared meals, quiet walks, small rituals that honored life without invoking loss. They also confronted an unexpected challenge: forgiveness. Not forgiveness as absolution, but forgiveness as survival. Carrying resentment indefinitely, they realized, was another form of captivity. This understanding did not arrive easily. It came in fragments, through counseling sessions and sleepless nights, through moments when anger felt heavier than sorrow. Forgiveness, they learned, is not a single decision. It is a practice, uneven and imperfect. In the town, social dynamics continued to recalibrate. Old alliances dissolved. New ones formed quietly. People who had once avoided the topic began referencing it indirectly, using phrases like "after everything that happened," or "you remember how things used to be." The case had become shorthand, a shared reference point for vulnerability. A local church hosted a series of discussions titled "Living After Silence." Attendance exceeded expectations. The sessions weren't about theology or law. They were about fear, about the instinct to look away, about the cost of not wanting to know. Participants spoke anonymously, voices cracking as they described moments when they sensed something was wrong and chose not to act. The room held those confessions without judgment. Silence, after all, had been the enemy. Meanwhile, the confessor's family continued to navigate a different aftermath. They lived under a shadow they hadn't chosen, balancing loyalty with disorientation. Some distanced themselves from the narrative entirely, refusing interviews, declining invitations to comment. Others sought dialogue, believing that understanding, even painful understanding, was better than isolation. Their grief was complicated by defensiveness, by the need to reconcile love with revulsion. There was no roadmap for that terrain. Psychologists who studied the case noted the phenomenon of secondary trauma spreading outward, affecting not just those directly involved but entire social networks. Trauma, they explained, is contagious when communities are small and histories intertwined. The Georgia case had demonstrated this vividly. It wasn't just a crime. It was a disruption of collective identity. As years passed, the physical transformation of the town accelerated. New businesses opened. Streets were repaved. A park expanded near the old crime scene, children's laughter replacing the hush that once lingered there. Some residents found this comforting. Others felt uneasy, as if progress were a kind of erasure. The debate resurfaced: how to honor the past without freezing the present. A compromise emerged in the form of an annual day of reflection, not publicized widely, not commercialized. Schools paused for a moment of silence. Flags were lowered briefly. There were no speeches, no names spoken over loudspeakers, just acknowledgement. It was enough. Investigators, now further removed from the initial storm, revisited the case with cooler eyes. They examined whether any corroborating evidence had been overlooked, not to reopen the investigation, but to strengthen institutional memory. They compiled a lessons learned document, circulated internally, candid and unsparing. It addressed bias, resource allocation, the dangers of complacency. It was not flattering. It was necessary. One section focused on the late-night tip that had triggered the case's resolution. Analysts dissected why that tip succeeded where others failed. Timing mattered. Technology mattered. But so did trust. The caller believed they would be heard. That belief, fragile and rare, had made all the difference. Rebuilding that trust became a priority, reflected in outreach programs and community liaisons. The media's interest had dwindled, but occasionally a new article surfaced, often written by someone unfamiliar with the town's nuance. These pieces tended to simplify, to dramatize. Locals learned to read them with skepticism, aware of how easily context is lost when distance intervenes. They stopped expecting accuracy from outsiders. Accuracy, they realized, is a local practice. For younger generations, the case transformed from lived experience into inherited knowledge. High school seniors wrote essays about it, grappling with themes of responsibility and time. Some argued that the confession represented moral courage, however delayed. Others rejected that framing, insisting courage delayed is courage denied. Teachers encouraged debate, not resolution. The goal was thinking, not agreement. As the 5th anniversary of the confession approached, the sheriff's office considered issuing a statement and ultimately chose not to. Silence, in this case, felt appropriate. The case had said enough. Any additional words risked reopening wounds without offering anything new. On that anniversary night, the town was quiet. No vigils, no gatherings, just routine. Some residents noticed the date and paused briefly. Others didn't. Both responses were valid. Healing, after all, does not follow schedule. In private, one investigator wrote a letter he never intended to send. It was addressed to the victim, written in plain language. He apologized for the years without answers. He acknowledged the limits of his profession. He promised nothing. Writing it was not cathartic. It was grounding, a reminder that behind every file number is a human absence. The Georgia 1990 cold case had become something rare, a solved mystery that refused to be reduced to triumph. It resisted celebration. It demanded humility. It exposed how easily certainty can be mistaken for truth, how justice can arrive incomplete and still matter. As the town moved forward, it carried the case not as a burden, but as a compass, a reminder to listen sooner, to question assumptions, to understand that silence is an action, not a neutral state, and that when truth finally emerges, late, imperfect, irrevocable, it changes not just what we know, but who we choose to be afterward. In that understanding, the case continued to live, not in headlines or archives alone, but in the quiet decisions people made every day, decisions shaped by the knowledge that time does not absolve, that voices matter, and that even the longest cold case leaves warmth behind, if only as a warning. By the 6th year, the case no longer pressed itself into daily thought, yet it had not faded. It existed like a watermark beneath the surface of ordinary life, visible only when the light hit at the right angle. The Georgia 1990 cold case had crossed into a quieter phase, where influence replaced intensity, and the town learned what it meant to live after knowing. Patterns emerged slowly. The way people responded to sirens at night, the way neighbors checked in on each other after dusk, the way a stranger lingering too long now drew attention instead of dismissal. These were not acts of paranoia. They were habits formed by memory, shaped by the understanding that danger rarely announces itself. Inside the sheriff's office, turnover brought new faces and new energy. Younger investigators arrived without the emotional baggage of the early years, yet they carried the institutional memory forward. They spoke of the case with respect, not obsession. It was referenced in training rooms, not hallways. It had become doctrine rather than fixation. A new cold case unit was formed at the state level, quietly funded, quietly staffed. The Georgia case was never named as the reason, but everyone knew it was. Policy often hides its origins, but outcomes tell the truth. Files that had gathered dust for decades were digitized, cross-referenced, exposed to technologies unavailable in earlier eras. Hope returned cautiously, tempered by realism. One such file bore striking similarities. A rural crime, minimal witnesses, a suspect long dismissed. Investigators moved carefully, aware of the risk of false parallels. Still, the echo was unmistakable. The past, it seemed, had patterns. Learning to recognize them without forcing conclusions became the new challenge. For the victim's family, time offered a fragile truce with grief. They no longer measured life against before and after. They measured it in smaller units. Moments of calm, days without anger, conversations that didn't circle back to the same questions. Progress was subtle, but it was real. They also began to encounter something unexpected, gratitude. Letters arrived from families of other victims, people still waiting, still hoping. These letters didn't ask for advice. They offered thanks. Thanks for speaking publicly, for refusing to let the case disappear, for proving that answers, however delayed, were possible. The family read each letter carefully, understanding the responsibility they carried simply by surviving. In the town, the younger generation pushed for transparency in ways their parents never had. They asked uncomfortable questions at council meetings. They requested access to records. They challenged authority with a confidence born not of rebellion, but of awareness. The cold case had taught them that institutions can fail without malice, and that vigilance is a form of civic duty. This shift unsettled some longtime residents. Privacy had once been sacred, suspicion unwelcome. Now, scrutiny was normalized. The balance between trust and oversight recalibrated, not perfectly, but deliberately. The town was learning how to hold its leaders accountable without dismantling cohesion. Meanwhile, the confessor's story continued to fracture over time. Biographers attempted to reconstruct his life, searching for origins, for moments where violence might have taken root. Childhood trauma was examined. Social pressures analyzed. Each narrative offered partial insight, none sufficient. Reducing a life to an explanation, investigators warned, risks excusing harm rather than understanding it. The victim, by contrast, gained dimension with each retelling. Friends shared memories that had never reached the public. Quirks, aspirations, the way she filled a room. These details mattered. They reclaimed space once dominated by the mechanics of crime. They reminded everyone that the center of the story was not the confession, but the life interrupted. An art installation appeared briefly in a local gallery. It featured empty frames suspended in midair, each representing a year without answers. Visitors walked through them, reading fragments of testimony etched into glass. The exhibit lasted 1 week. It wasn't advertised widely. Those who attended left quietly, carrying something unspoken with them. As the case receded further into history, a paradox emerged. Distance made it easier to discuss, but harder to feel. Emotional immediacy softened, replaced by intellectual reflection. Some worried this meant forgetting. Others argued it meant integration. Trauma, they said, doesn't vanish. It settles. Law enforcement agencies continued to cite the case in internal reviews, often pairing it with newer successes. The contrast was instructive. Faster resolutions, better communication, earlier interventions. Progress measured not in perfection, but improvement. The Georgia case had become a benchmark, a reminder of what delay costs. Occasionally, a rumor surfaced suggesting additional secrets still buried. An unverified witness. A piece of evidence misfiled. Each claim was investigated, each dismissed quietly. The process itself mattered more than the outcome. Taking claims seriously signaled commitment to truth, even when truth refused to change. The town's annual calendar adjusted around the case almost unconsciously. Events avoided certain dates. Language softened around anniversaries. No one issued directives. The adjustments emerged organically, shaped by shared understanding. This was how communities adapt, not through policy alone, but through instinct. One evening, a storm knocked out power across several neighborhoods. In the darkness, people gathered on porches, talking, sharing candles. Someone mentioned the case, not by name, but by implication. Another person nodded. No one elaborated. The silence felt companionable rather than heavy. The past, for once, did not dominate the present. In academic circles, the case was cited as evidence that confession is not a finish line. Scholars emphasized that truth without accountability complicates justice, forcing societies to redefine resolution. The Georgia case challenged binary thinking. It refused to sit comfortably in categories like solved or unsolved. It existed in between. For the investigators who had stayed with the case longest, retirement loomed. They prepared to leave behind not just jobs, but stories that had shaped their identities. Exit interviews focused less on procedure and more on philosophy. What had they learned? What would they do differently? Their answers were thoughtful, restrained, honest. They spoke of humility, of patience, of the danger of certainty. On one such interview, A detective paused before answering the final question. Did the confession bring peace? He considered the word carefully. Peace, he said, is not the right metric. Understanding is. And understanding, while incomplete, had grown. As the 7th year approached, the town stood at a quiet threshold. The case was no longer active. It was no longer debated. It was remembered. Memory, unlike obsession, allows space for life to continue. It carries lessons without demanding attention. The Georgia 1990 cold case had traveled a long arc, from shock to scrutiny to integration. It had changed systems, relationships, expectations. It had forced a reckoning with time and silence, with the limits of justice and the resilience of truth. And still, beneath it all, one fact remained. The case was not a story that ended. It was a story that transformed. From mystery to mirror. From headline to heritage. From unanswered question to enduring caution. In that transformation, the town found something fragile and rare. The ability to move forward without pretending the past had disappeared. To live with knowledge instead of fear. To accept that some answers arrive too late and still matter. The watermark remained. Faint, persistent. Visible only when the light shifted. A reminder that truth, once revealed, never fully recedes. It waits quietly, shaping what comes next. Years passed, not with the drama of headlines or the urgency of press conferences, but with the slow, almost imperceptible movement of a clock no one watched anymore. The Georgia 1990 cold case no longer dominated conversations, yet had become embedded in the town's identity, woven into the way people spoke about trust, about time, about truth. It was no longer something that happened once. It was something that continued to shape what followed. New families moved in. They learned about the case not from newspapers, but from pauses in conversation, from the way longtime residents changed tone when certain places were mentioned. A gas station on the edge of town. A quiet road that curved too sharply for comfort. A stretch of woods that had been partially cleared, yet never felt ordinary. Geography, once neutral, carried emotional residue. Schools began to include local history units that referenced the case indirectly. Not details, not names, but themes. Civic responsibility. The importance of speaking up. The danger of assuming someone else will act. Teachers were careful, aware of the thin line between education and exploitation. The goal was not to reopen wounds, but to prevent repetition. For the victim's family, time brought a complicated calm. Grief no longer surged unexpectedly. It flowed in predictable currents. Anniversaries were still heavy, but they were no longer unbearable. They had learned how to carry memory without letting it hollow them out. That skill, hard-earned, became something they shared quietly with others who asked. The confession, once seismic, began to settle into its final form. Legal scholars debated its weight. Journalists revisited it with restraint rather than fervor. The confessor himself became less of a figure and more of a footnote, his words preserved but no longer amplified. This was not forgiveness. It was proportion. The story was finally being told in balance. Yet balance did not mean closure. Questions lingered like unfinished sentences. Why now? Why not sooner? What kept the truth buried for so long? Each answer led to another question, branching endlessly. The town learned to live with this uncertainty, understanding that not all mysteries resolve cleanly. Law enforcement continued to refine its practices, often citing the Georgia case internally. Younger officers listened with attention, recognizing that the mistakes of the past were not accusations, but warnings. Training emphasized listening over assumption, patience over speed. Technology advanced, but humility remained the most valued tool. One former investigator, now retired, returned to the town for a lecture at a regional conference. He spoke plainly, without drama. He described the early days of the case, the confidence they had mistaken for clarity, the silence they had underestimated. The room was quiet, not because the story was shocking, but because it was familiar. Many had their own versions. Outside official channels, the case lived on in subtler ways. A podcast episode here, an academic paper there. Each retelling stripped away a bit more sensationalism, leaving behind something more durable. Context. The case became less about crime and more about systems, about how societies respond to harm over time. The town itself continued to evolve. New businesses opened, old ones closed, streets were repaved, buildings renovated. Progress did not erase memory, it layered over it. The past remained accessible, but it no longer dominated the landscape. This was not forgetting, it was coexistence. One evening, during a local town hall, a resident stood up and spoke about transparency in government. She referenced the case without naming it, her voice steady. The room understood. Heads nodded. The moment passed without applause, without spectacle. Change, it seemed, no longer required drama to be acknowledged. The victim's name appeared occasionally in unexpected places. A scholarship fund, a library plaque, a community garden. These were not monuments to tragedy, but to presence. They affirmed that a life, though ended violently, could still generate growth. The family approved each gesture carefully, guarding against performative remembrance. In private moments, they still wondered about the road not taken, about what life might have looked like if truth had come sooner. These thoughts were unavoidable, but they no longer consumed. Acceptance did not mean approval. It meant survival. The cold case designation, once heavy with implication, lost some of its sting. It became a technical term rather than an emotional verdict. The case had moved beyond classification. It existed in a category of its own, defined by impact rather than status. As the 10th year since the confession approached, a local journalist proposed a retrospective. Not an expose, not a rehash, a reflection. The piece focused on aftermath rather than action, on consequences rather than crime. It was published quietly, without fanfare. Those who read it did so slowly. The article ended with a simple observation. That time does not heal all wounds, but it does change how they are carried. The sentence lingered, shared among readers, not because it was profound, but because it felt accurate. In law schools, the case was used to illustrate ethical dilemmas. When does truth outweigh procedure? What responsibility does a dying confession carry? How should institutions respond when justice arrives incomplete? Students debated vigorously, aware that their answers would one day matter. Back in the town, life continued with a steadiness that once seemed impossible. Children rode bikes past places their parents had once avoided. Laughter returned to streets that had known silence. These were not signs of forgetting. They were signs of resilience. The memory of the case remained strongest in moments of quiet. Late nights, empty roads, the pause before sleep when thoughts wander. In those moments, the unanswered questions resurfaced, not demanding resolution, but acknowledgement. The Georgia 1990 cold case had become less about what happened and more about what followed, about how a community absorbed shock, processed truth, and rebuilt trust, about how justice, delayed and imperfect, still altered the trajectory of countless lives. As the decade mark passed without ceremony, there was no sense of ending, only continuation. The story had outgrown its origins, extending into policies, attitudes, and quiet personal decisions made every day. And in that continuation, something subtle but significant occurred. The case no longer defined the town. The town defined how the case was remembered, not as a wound that never healed, but as a scar that taught caution, empathy, and resolve. The truth, once buried, had reshaped the ground above it, not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently.